and uh, and I'm very happy to see you all here, and I'm very honored to be one of the worldwide Doyle lecturers this year. This year, um, the headline for my lecture is "Was Killing Holmes a Stroke of Genius?" And we will look at the early success of Sherlock Holmes, the success from when the stories started being published in the Strand magazine and up to the final problem. And I prefer to divide this success into four phases. The first phase is the novelty phase, and it goes on from July 1891 with the first story, A Scandal in Bohemia, to the 12th story in June 1892. And if we talk about the autumn of 1891, the first 6 months in the Strand magazine, at that time, Sherlock Holmes was there were very little in the newspapers about Sherlock Holmes, and when there were something written, it was only a sentence or something, often in the reviews of the new issue of the Strand magazine. You could the Sherlock Holmes stories soon became popular among the critics, or what should I say, the newspapers, in that way that they got very good reviews, but still only in one sentence. So there weren't that many words explaining how good they were, but you could clearly see that they were popular among the readers. And if there was an immediate success, because often when we talk about the first stories in the Strand magazine, we claim that there was a huge success immediately, directly when they were published. But you can't really see that in the newspapers or the journals of the time. So if there was that kind of success, that rumor can only have been by word of mouth. The first time we can see something of a hint of popularity is when actually an American newspaper wrote that Conan Doyle's shorter stories, more particularly those centering around the character of Sherlock Holmes, have won him a host of admirers. It's not much of a hint of a popularity, but anyway, that's almost the only thing that was written that gives us a hint of the success. There is also from the Glasgow Herald, it was a review of A Study in Scarlet, a new edition of it, and it says it's a stirring one in which Mr. Sherlock Holmes, whose detective adventures are so popular, is introduced for the first time. And that is proof that there was a popularity, but I wouldn't say that it was a success, not in that way that we normally speak about Sherlock Holmes the first half a year in the Strand magazine. However, there is another quotation from the Yorkshire Evening Post in April 1892, when there had been, 10 Sherlock Holmes stories published in the Strand magazine. And that is probably the best quotation yet. It says, perhaps the extraordinary success of the Strand magazine is due more to Conan Doyle's fascinating creation of Sherlock Holmes than any other feature. And I would say that the Strand magazine, which had at that time maybe more up to 300,000 copies sold, It was, of course, a huge success having such a popular character in these issues. So this is only the novelty phase, and this lecture is not really going to talk about that, but it was word of mouth, and it was nothing in the press, not really. And you wouldn't say that Sherlock Holmes was famous apart from among the readers of the Strand magazines. Next phase is the expanding phase. Goes on from July that year to October 1893. And we should know that during the autumn of 1892, there were no new Sherlock Holmes stories. So the news that were written about Sherlock Holmes and the mentions of him were because of the previous success, not really because of new stories. And that's interesting that Sherlock Holmes actually was a name among people, even if there weren't any new stories published. And I've done some statistics. This shows the very low numbers of newspaper articles mentioning this success. And when I say mention, it can say that he was famous, the famous Sherlock Holmes, or the popular Sherlock Holmes stories, or whatever that hints towards a success. But there were one or two in the autumn of 1891, and there were 4 in late spring, and 3 during summer, and a little bit more during October to December. I just show you this because if you didn't read Strand magazine and you hadn't heard that word of mouth, you probably weren't aware of Sherlock Holmes that way that we maybe think you were, because I have also on to the right, I have shown how many articles at all there were mentioning Sherlock Holmes, and of course I kind of missed some of them, but when we together with my co-editors have put together the book series about Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, we have really searched for newspaper articles in both the UK and the US and Australia and so on. And from 1891, there are, as you can see, 8 plus 12 articles mentioning Sherlock Holmes at all. That's very, very little, and that's mostly the reviews of the Strand magazine. And during 1892, something happened, and especially during the autumn of late 1892. And what happened was that there were more reviews, of course, especially when the collection, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes, was published in both US and the UK, and there were he was compared to other detectives, and people wished that he could solve real crimes. So something happened during fall 1892, and as I said, that was a period when was a time when there were no new Sherlock Holmes stories until December 1892, when the Silver Blaze was published. And during that autumn 1892, it was the first appearing of Holmes in the headline, and that article was about Dr. Joseph Bell, because it had become known that he was the prototype for Sherlock Holmes. So that turned into a headline. But there weren't any other headlines about Sherlock Holmes. And before autumn 1892, no longer articles had been written about Holmes. But the first ones, the really first ones, long articles about Sherlock Holmes was when the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes were published in the US in October 1892. And of course, there were reviews in the UK too, but the American reviews were much longer and really looked into the Sherlock Holmes character and the stories. And also the phrase "to be your Sherlock Holmes" or all equivalent things of that, that turned up in the newspapers. So at this time, Sherlock Holmes was a name that people associated with a certain type of person or a detective. And we can also find the first profound criticism of the facts in the Sherlock Holmes story. That is a really interesting article from the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News, which criticized Conan Doyle's knowledge of horse racing, or his lack of knowledge, rather, of horse racing in Silver Blaze. So something happened during that time, but still there weren't that much. This is an interesting quotation from the Pall Mall Gazette in April 1893. If we move on to spring 1893, how much Mr. Sherlock Holmes is responsible for the success of the Strand magazine, or how much the Strand magazine is responsible for the success of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, it would be difficult to determine. But there is no question as to Mr. Holmes's boom. And that says a lot about the situation at the time. And also the fact that Sherlock Holmes and Strand magazine were so connected to each other, so intimately connected. And talking about that, I also did some statistics because I needed it. But the first printing of the Strand magazine issues, how much did the print run grow during these years? The first issue of Strand magazine, I don't have the first printing, but it sold some 350,000 copies. And then they chose to have first printings of around 200,000 at the start, and then it went on to 300,000 in mid 1892, and it actually stopped around there. It went up to maybe 320,000 or 350,000 at the end. And first printing was, of course, only first printing. They added printings of it as soon as they sold out. So maybe they sold 20 or 30,000 more. But and the yellow lines are marks where the Sherlock Holmes stories were published during these years in the Strand magazine. So I think we can see during the first set of 12 stories that the success of Strand magazine and the success of Sherlock Holmes was connected, because it went from 200,000 to 300,000 copies. But it didn't, the Strand magazine didn't stop sell copies when there weren't any Sherlock Holmes stories during later part of 1892. So it was a very popular magazine anyway. So maybe it's a little bit of both, that Strand magazine got attention to Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes gave attention to Strand magazine. And this was the expanding phase. There were longer texts, and Holmes was more frequently, but very seldom mentioned as a success. But it happened. And the name Sherlock Holmes was used much more outside the stories in connection to, well, pretty much anything. And then the subject for this lecture, the Reichenbach phase, which goes on from November 1893 to January 1894. And this phase it started already in November, because in the US, the final problem was published in November, and in the UK it wasn't until mid-December. And all the hype around Sherlock Holmes continued to January, February, and so on. But, well, we'll have a look at it. This is what happened. I now have put together some statistics again for articles mentioning Holmes' popularity. And what I mean, I've searched for articles mentioning the famous Sherlock Holmes, and that he has there are lots of readers following his adventures and so on. And there was, well, pretty much already earlier this year, but you can see in October to December, or it's practically mostly December, that's when it happened. Also, the number of the total number of articles mentioning Sherlock Holmes went from maybe 30 to 50 for the first 3 quarters, respectively, and up to more than 160 articles mentioning Sherlock Holmes in October to December, and almost 100 of these were in December. And the word famous was often used. For example, the famous detective Sherlock Holmes. So what was this all about? Well, we know it was the final problem. But there was also other things going on. It was autumn 1893 was sort of a perfect storm, because everything seemed to be about Sherlock Holmes at the moment. Charles Brookfield played Sherlock Holmes. You can see him to the left, well, to the right in the screen, but to the left in the illustration, in Under the Clock, which was a humoristic short theater piece, but theater play, but just a sketch. But and Joseph Bell, Dr. Joseph Bell, was an expert witness in the Ardlamont case, and the press loved to call him Sherlock Holmes. So there were a lot of headlines mentioning Sherlock Holmes, but that was really Joseph Bell when he was an expert witness. And Conan Doyle went on a lecture tour, and well, the press loved to call him Sherlock Holmes too. So apart from the final problem and the other things going on in the Strand magazine, there were many things around Sherlock Holmes at the time. And now I just picked some headlines. And this is the fascinating thing, I think, when the final problem came. Suddenly, Sherlock Holmes was in the headlines of the newspaper. I think there were maybe 3 or 4 articles where Sherlock Holmes had been in the headline. The character Sherlock Holmes had been in the headline before that, but now he was everywhere. And these headlines are from the UK and the US, randomly. I can't say exactly which newspapers, but big ones and small ones, and all kinds of newspapers wrote about the death of Sherlock Holmes, the killing of Sherlock Holmes, the last of Sherlock Holmes, and exit Sherlock Holmes. Well, you can see, and there are more. Sherlock Holmes dies. Sherlock Holmes, widespread grief at the sudden demise of this great man. Sherlock Holmes's obituary, yes. This is from American newspaper in Rochester, New York. Is Sherlock Holmes dead? Who has not heard of Sherlock Holmes? Who has not read accounts of his wonderful exploits as a detective, given to the world by his intimate friend, Dr. Watson of London, through the medium of Conan Doyle's pen? This says a lot about the fame Sherlock Holmes had come to at that point in time. And what is interesting with all this, the press writing so much about Sherlock Holmes at the time, because the articles about Sherlock Holmes, you saw some of the headlines, but the articles, they were long ones. They weren't just one sentence or a few lines or so, but 20, 30 lines and even more. Sherlock Holmes was a phenomenon. And because of the final problem, it went into the press. It had never really been written about before, but the death of Sherlock Holmes made him eternal. There were poems written. These are a few that I found in different newspapers. You can't read these, but if anyone is interested, I can send them to you. But I just show you now that what kind of material there was in the newspapers at the time. Advertisements, other people using Sherlock Holmes. For example, Sherlock Holmes is dead, but in the next issue of the Comet begins the tragedy of Rue de la Paix. And we have an advertisement for Beecham's Pills. That classic, which is the last letter from Sherlock Holmes. Also referencing to his unknown whereabouts. I love this one. It's an advertisement, but it's a man. It's a lecture where a man in Northampton will show 50 limelight views, and amongst the views shown and described will be scene of the death of Sherlock Holmes, because the subject for the lecture is a ramble in Switzerland and Belgium. And this was already in February 1894, just 2 months after the publishing of the final problem. So you can really see how people wanted to know more about this place where he died. There were jokes. I mean, there had been jokes before, but there were jokes about his death too. Someone asked, why is Sherlock Holmes like the turkeys in the local shop? And gives the answer as, because both have been killed for Christmas. Well, you may laugh at it. It's maybe not a great joke, but... And this illustration is fun. It's from Today, which was edited by Jerome K. Jerome. editor Nunes, which is George Nunes, editor of the Strand magazine, he says, "Great Scott, Doyle, is he dead?" And the corpse, which is Sherlock Holmes, if you can see that, "It's all right, Governor. The doctor knows what to do when you want me." And there was so much in these newspaper articles. There were so many emotions. You can really feel that people loved Sherlock Holmes, and you can actually you could also see that some people didn't like Sherlock Holmes, and said that Conan Doyle had killed him not a day too soon. But in this article from the Leeds Times, I won't read the whole article, but it says things like, "There were no adequate reasons why he should die. There were many good reasons why he should live. And Sherlock Holmes was not a man who ought to have come to a violent end. Holmes should have had a calm, peaceful death." And the author actually suggests that he should have taken an overdose of chloral, which which would have led to this calm, peaceful death. Um, and he later says, "Sherlock Holmes has endeared himself to us. He is an old friend. It is not without a touch of sorrow that we leave him at the bottom of the chasm at Reichenbach, where the torrent is even now tearing him limb from limb." And it goes on like this for the whole article. And it's so clear that the author of this article, he was a real fan. There had been uh, people wishing that Sherlock Holmes could have solved real life crimes, but after the death of Sherlock Holmes, it became even more used in these. There was a stolen pocketbook, and there was the Arlamont case, and there was another murderer, and the willful murder of a hospital nurse, and all of them referring to Sherlock Holmes as the dead. What chance this would have been for the late lamented Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes is dead. It's really a great pity that he died so inopportunely. And it goes on like that. And the funny thing with these is that if you didn't know that Sherlock Holmes was a character in fiction, you wouldn't. Now let's see. Now it's suddenly my screen changed here. I hope you can still see. Yes, I think you can see. Uh, and sorry about this break. What was I saying? Yeah, what it was almost like he was a real person, which they referred to. I must find my document again. One moment. It suddenly disappeared from my screen.
We can still see it.
You can see, you still see it. Yes, but I have to.
We have real life crimes up still with quotes.
Yeah, I just must find it on my own screen because suddenly it disappeared from. Sorry. I think I might move. Have I moved it to another screen? Oh, this is embarrassing.
It's
It
kind of
just
got the same
disappeared
title.
from my own screen. Um, oh, 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 here we are. I think I found it now. Yes,
Excellent.
thankfully. There was also a man in Manchester, a beggar who came to police court. He had given his name as Sherlock Holmes. This is just a tiny thing, but it shows that Sherlock Holmes suddenly was a name for the headlines. And it was interesting to put his name in headlines. There was a copyright problem with the death of Sherlock Holmes because in 1894 there was a man who wanted to write pastiches actually in Pittman's shorthand, and they were called the School Days of Sherlock Holmes. And Conan Doyle protested, and he commented that, well, actually, he commented that nor would my use of Sherlock Holmes have done any harm to Dr. Doyle, for at the very time when the public had become most interested in that mythical hero, he was killed with a suddenness that caused some to assert that the author's vivid imagination had run to seed. And there were I think there were other parody and pastiche authors who thought that, well, he is dead. We can use the character now. And in the end, he couldn't use the name, the title, the School Days of Sherlock Holmes, so he changed it to the School Days of Sherlock, and that was fine. There was a parody series called The Picklock Holes, running in Punch. And the eighth story in that series had to be rewritten because of when the final problem was published and Sherlock Holmes was suddenly dead. So it ends with a scrap of paper beginning with the following text: "My dear Potson, it has been a duel to the death, and both of us perished. By the kindness of my late opponent, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have been permitted to expire after him and to use the few remaining seconds of life that remain in me in writing to you." And we can also see an illustration where Picklock Holmes stands on the cliff, and it says, dropping an H, is from a drawing taken on the spot. Picklock H lets down Sherlock H easily. So the effect of the final problem was not what everyone's had expected. For example, they had to rewrite the parody. And this is also interesting. There were a lot of theories in the press about what did really happen at Reichenbach. Did he really die? There was one theory about that Sherlock Holmes is not dead. It was just Dr. Watson was so fed up with him, so he killed him, not really, but in a false narrative. So everybody believed Sherlock Holmes was dead. And the other, St. James's Gazette, they were noting that the body had not been found, and he is not dead. He's lying low. And all of these articles, they were dissolving the boundaries between fiction and reality. This is from Australia, and I've marked the upper one with yellow here because this is just a typical newspaper article about different facts from all over the world, and it says Sherlock Holmes is dead. And next item is Tolstoy and Ibsen are both 65 years of age. Um, and it goes on about the Princess of Wales's winter furs are valued at £12,000, and all of these are real facts. And of course, it's a real fact about Sherlock Holmes. But again, it's almost as he is treated as a real person. And this, I just put this in women reading Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, I don't doubt it. But the thing is that in that time, there were so many stories written for women or for men, not typically written for both sexes. So Dr. Robertson Nichol, who was a journalist and editor, in an interview about other things, he commented upon what women were reading, and he said that it has been recognized that women like to read something more stirring than what they are generally supplied to in literature. So, and he also says that the success of the Strand magazine has demonstrated it, for women have read Sherlock Holmes with the intensest interest. And that is also true about young people reading Strand magazine. We can see it mentioned in the newspapers, boys reading and old people and from different social classes. So that was part of the success, that it was really for everyone. And again, this I think this is interesting with the boundaries between fiction and reality. In one article from Westminster Gazette, it says that Sherlock Holmes was as real a person as any other they read of in the newspapers, any real persons. And in Harper's Weekly from that time, it's fun to see how they almost play the game, the Sherlockian game. It's an article in. It doesn't say anything about Conan Doyle really. It really treats Sherlock Holmes as a real person, and it says. It seems that through the intervention of one Doyle, a physician who had a claim upon him, he was induced to undertake a case of desperate peril in which there is every reason to believe that he lost his life. And that is very much what we do when we treat Sherlock Holmes as a real person, and Doyle as, well, a literary agent, or in this case, a physician having a claim upon him. There was also an anonymous article in the St. James's Gazette, but it was through other sources we have found out that it was J.M. Barrie who wrote it, Conan Doyle's friend. And that article can be found on internet. It's a really interesting article. It's sort of a newspaper report from the actual events at the Reichenbach, but it is a pastiche in the same time. But that was also written, published December 29th. And that is very much the Reichenbach phase, that the death of Sherlock Holmes was a gigantic media success. And it made headlines all over the place. And the name Sherlock Holmes became a clickbait, really. everywhere where you wanted people to read articles, and if you could use Sherlock Holmes in some way, you put it in the headline. And also in advertising, there was more and more in the coming years. And Sherlock Holmes really was famous now. And as we saw, the first sign of the game. There's a nice illustration, by the way, from the Boston Globe, from the final problem. And after the Reichsbach phase comes, well, that phase going on from 1894 to 1899. We won't talk about it in this lecture, but that was the late detective phase, because in the press, Holmes was often treated like a deceased real person. He was often referred to as the late Sherlock Holmes, the late lamented Sherlock Holmes. And it was often hard to see in newspaper articles if Sherlock Holmes was a literary character or a real person. He was sort of both at the same time. And after the late detective phase, which we definitely won't talk about today, comes the Gillette phase, which changed so much around Sherlock Holmes. And to end this, I found Picklock Holes is saying it in the best way, I think. This is from Punch, December 23rd. It's from one of the previous Picklock Holes stories, and it says, there are, it seems, rumors about to the effect that my marvelous friend Picklock Holes is dead. Some even go so far as to assert that he never existed. I leave these two factions to fight the matter out. If he is dead, he must have existed. If he never existed, he cannot have died. This shows the folly of relying on rumor. Samuel Potson. Was killing Holmes a stroke of genius? Yes. Conan Doyle wanted to get rid of Sherlock Holmes and have time with other things, but I don't think he he was satisfied, but only to a certain extent, because he hadn't anticipated that the success would grow bigger with the death of Sherlock Holmes, because suddenly he wasn't just a literary character. There weren't just stories about Sherlock Holmes, but he had become a phenomenon, much due to all the writings connected to the final problem and the death of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed the statistics. They were really, really interesting to see physically
Sorry
charted
about
out.
that the break in the middle when my screen suddenly disappeared.
Please don't worry. This is a Zoom event. Anything can happen, and tends to. So, as I was saying before, everyone arrived. It does that. It changes every year, and it's always very confusing. Has anyone got any questions? Would anyone like to ask a question? Let me get my chat box up. Feel free, Mattias. Are you okay if people come off? You're right if people just talk to you directly rather than putting it in the chat box.
Yes.
So do
Please
come
talk
off.
freely.
Yeah. Oh, I've got lots of love coming through on the messages. Brilliant presentation. Thank you. It's really interesting. I wanted to ask you a question and I wrote it down and then you answered it, which was quite good. So well done. I find it really interesting that the Strand's popularity grew at the same time. Was there a leader in that, do you think? Was there at any point where Conan Doyle was kind of, I don't know, really? Do you think he really knew? Did he understand what he was doing? Because he wouldn't have seen the stats, would he?
Well, he knew that it was a growing success because he I mean, he demanded more and more money, and he got it. So he understood that. Well, it wasn't hard to see that Strand magazine was the most successful magazine of the time, of that kind. I mean, George Newnes' weekly newspaper Titbits had, of course, 600,000 copies every week, but of the monthly journals, there wasn't anything as big as the Strand magazine, and so I think Conan Doyle must have understood that he was really part of that success, and maybe the reason for that success, but he wasn't the only reason. There were so many other things going on in Strand magazine, and it's interesting to see that. I don't have the numbers, but there is nothing pointing at the number of copies went down after the death of Sherlock Holmes. There is a rumor in which we have often quoted that 20,000 subscribers well, dropped off from the Strand magazine following the final problem, but we can't really. There is no evidence for that, and actually, when I've looked at that fact, the oldest source for that is Charles Hyam's Conan Doyle biography from the 1970s, and that is not a good source because I think I counted to 20 errors in just that page. So. But it is one of those myths that has kept surviving.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks very much. Hi, Mattias. That was great. Thank you very much. I had just a question for you on what your take is on whether or not Conan Doyle was keeping his options open in the way that he chose to write the final problem. And I'm taken there particularly by your reference to the St. James Gazette, where there is the comment about he's not dead, he's just lying low. So, do you think what you make of that? Do you think
yes, when he went to the on his US lecture tour later in 1894, in October to December, he frequently got the question that is Sherlock Holmes really dead? Will he come back? And he always said no, he won't come back. But in one interview, he actually said that, well, I might get him back, but he will in a few years, not now. But what many hoped for was that, okay, these are the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, but we know that Dr. Watson knew about other Sherlock Holmes mysteries. So even if Sherlock Holmes is dead, Conan Doyle could write more stories about Sherlock Holmes, about his other cases that he was investigating. And there were also people suggesting that, well, if Sherlock Holmes isn't available, why not his brother, Mycroft Holmes, who seems to be a very intelligent person? He could be a detective for a number of stories. And it's also interesting to see that when the Martin Hewitt detective stories was the substitute for Sherlock Holmes in the Strand magazine after the final problem, they were from the start anonymously published. So many thought that these were the new stories by Conan Doyle. They weren't. They were by Arthur Morrison. But many believed that from the beginning that these were the new Conan Doyle stories, and they thought that, well, he writes as good as usual.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Susan, hello. Would you like to ask your question?
Microphone.
Give me a second for my finger to find the button, hey? Yes, it's nice to see you again. As you're in the middle of your brilliant talk today, you mentioned the Ardlamont case and
yes.
Joe Bell's involvement with that. There was a book about it a couple of years ago where someone was postulating that it was the catalyst for Conan Doyle taking off and writing about Sherlock Holmes. Do you have any particular thoughts on
that? I'm not sure how much. I actually don't think Conan Doyle was aware of that much about the Ardlamont case because, well, he had of course read about the murder previously during the autumn of 1893, but I think the murder was in, well, September, October, maybe. But the trial was in December, and at that time, Conan Doyle was in Davos. He wasn't in the UK, and he didn't see all these writings about the trial, and he didn't. Well, he could, of course, read English newspapers in Davos. He probably did, but he had other things on his mind at that time, I think. And I don't think it was such a complicated criminal case, and it's hard to understand all the nuances of that case. But I don't think Conan Doyle ever commented or was inspired by anything of it.
Yeah, I've never seen anything about it myself. I was wondering if you had, because you've been reading far more newspapers than I have.
Yes, I have a stack of articles about the Ardlamont case because I actually wrote a short story about that sort of true crime short story some years ago, but I found it rather boring. It wasn't that fascinating.
I got more interested in the idea of Patrick Heron Watson and Joe Bell being the Holmes and Watson of Edinburgh being brought in to testify for various murder cases. Heron Watson being a ballistics expert, among other things. But nobody's really ever written about that other than some stuff in Eli LeBeau's book.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something to look at in your copious free time.
Thank you, Susan. I just have to mention, so we've had some stuff in the chat box from Teresa asking to hear more about Potson. Do we know who wrote this Punch Pitlock Holes parody? And actually, Alexis, thank you very much, has replied. So just to let you know, there is stuff going on in the chat box as well, people, if you want to have a look, and we will save the chat as well. I think, John, if it's all right, we'll go with you, and then we'll go to you, Paul. Okay.
Thank you. Great presentation, Mattias.
Thank you.
Getting back to Holmes' death, maybe I'm a bit cynical, but I think if Doyle had really wanted to get rid of him, I think there would have been a body. Watson would have made an epic eulogy at the funeral. And I think in the back of his mind was, look, I don't like this character. It's a pain, but if I ever need some money, it's like an inheritance.
Yes. Well, yes, that might have been the case. Either that, or I think that he just wanted to write a good story that would end Sherlock Holmes and in a dramatic way. And if the body would have been found, that would have make it less dramatic at the end of the story. So I think he just wanted to make the story as good as possible.
Thank you. Paul and Teresa?
Yeah, my question, Mattias, is with the stats and so on. You've talked about Martin Hewitt taking over from Holmes, and how did you know how the Strand magazine's sales figures went after the death of Holmes? What, did they steady or did they decline particularly, or just keep? I mean, obviously we know it continued.
The thing is that I haven't been able to find any numbers because up to the autumn of 1893, they published the first printing, the print run of the first printing in their advertisements. Not every time, but now and then, and that's the way I could make those dots in the statistics. I searched for information in a number of different newspapers to find these numbers, but I couldn't find anything after 1893. Not in 1894. I could find in 1895 something saying that. I'm trying to remember what it said, but it was actually a number saying that the Strand magazine sold in 500,000 copies, and that can't have been true. But my theory is that because that was from a shareholders meeting, my theory is that it includes the US version of Strand magazine. But it definitely wasn't 500,000, but it wasn't lower. I just think that they stayed at print runs of between 300 and 350,000. And I've seen an advertisement which was directed to other advertisers that where they claim that they had they sold in 350,000 copies, and that's so many you will reach when you put an ad in our magazine. So I think it stayed between those numbers.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. We've got a couple of comments in the chat box. Of course, Doyle didn't need to bring Holmes back to life to continue writing about him like he did with The Hound. That's from Edward. And we also have from Jim, for that matter, the body of Moriarty was never recovered, right?
Yeah, and there were a lot of theories in the newspapers of 1893 about that, the body of Moriarty too. And also this was used by at least a few parody writers and pastiche writers during the upcoming 2 years in the mid 1890s, that Moriarty was in fact alive. And in one parody it was mentioned that both Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty had parachutes under their clothes, so they survived, both of them, because of that.
Brilliant. I've heard of that. Thank you. Has anyone got any other questions? Anything else to add? It's really fascinating. Thank you, Mattias. Have you got would you like to do some book publicity while you're there? Would you like to explain what's next?
What I'm doing? Oh,
yes.
sorry.
Yeah. Would you like to do a book plug?
Yes, yeah. Well, there's a book plug, but I don't know when that book will be published. Well, I'm working on a book, but when I'm saying working, I'm thinking of a book, or at least researching for a book, and this lecture was sort of part of that research because I'm working on a book. The working title is Sherlock Holmes in His Time, and it's about these years from 1887 to 1930. What the contemporary perspective on Sherlock Holmes was, because we always seem to rely on what Conan Doyle said about the Sherlock Holmes success, and we don't have that huge amount of other sources around the success and what really happened. For example, what did it mean to a study in Scarlet that it was a Christmas annual? Did that have any effect on the number of readers it reached and so on? And definitely a lot of what Conan Doyle said in his autobiography and elsewhere is just not correct, because he didn't know himself. He thought that Sherlock Holmes in the US had become famous because of the pirate copies, but the thing is that there weren't pirate copies of Sherlock Holmes stories that made Conan Doyle successful in the US. They were pirate copies of Micah Clarke, his novel, but he didn't know himself. But you can find that in just the sheer amount of reviews from that time. So thanks to the digital newspaper archives, there's so much things you can find out, and sort of changed the way we look at the early Sherlock Holmes success. So that's what I'm trying to put together a book about.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll really look forward to hearing.
Yes, when From Holmes to Sherlock was a very much a look at everything, but now I just take these 40 years and go really deep, and the only way I can do it is by learning new things myself. If I don't learn new things, it's not interesting.
That's fantastic. We've already got someone saying they're willing to pre-order that book today. There you go.
Thanks.
And Edith has said it would be good to see some of the persistent myths corrected. Yeah, good.
Mattias. And I also should say that the statistics I showed you, there might be errors in it because there might be newspaper articles I haven't found. There might be magazines that I haven't found it at the hathitrust.org website and so on. But at least it's approximately this is what happened. It's as near as we can come at the moment.
Yes, of course. I wish we have so many, as you all know, we have a huge collection of magazines and newspaper articles in the Richard Lance and Green Conan Doyle collection, and I would love it if we could get those digitized. You'll be pleased to know we have started. It is such slow progress, as I'm sure you can imagine. But we are actually making a headway. We are getting somewhere, so it would be lovely to do that. It would be lovely to kind of be able to open it up. But in the meantime, you know, if anyone's just passing Portsmouth in the UK and you want to pop in to see us, please do, because that would be lovely. It's all there to physically look through, and we're working on getting it online. So,
and I should also add that it was really thanks to the Portsmouth collection, Sherlock Holmes collection, Conan Doyle collection, that it was possible at all to write from Holmes to Sherlock. You can't imagine how much of that material comes from the collection.
It's vast, I can imagine. Yeah, I could easily get lost. Michael and I often talk about not falling down the rabbit hole because I don't think we would leave the building. It would be quite it would be quite a thing. And sometimes we do wish that there was a fire alarm, or we'd or not a reverse fire alarm, so we'd get locked in and then we'd have to stay and read the books. What a shame that would be overnight. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Anyway, thank you. We Sherlockians live in the rabbit hole. You're in good company. Yes. I would definitely. I have 2 children, and maybe once they have left home, I will fall in properly and never to be seen again. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Mattias, for taking part and for joining us. It's been a long time coming to meet you and to get you here, so thank you ever so much. Just to remind you, we have our final talk on Monday with Douglas Kerr. Again, we've somehow managed to match the theme of these talks this year. I don't know how we've done that, but it's done brilliantly. Thank you all for coming. There will be recordings of this as well. I did manage to press record very late, but I did do it. Apologies for not giving you advance warning.
Thank you, Laura. I think you're kind of the unsung hero of all this series.
No,
thank you very much.
I just go by the seat of my pants, to be honest, and just hope it all works out. And thank you all for being so kind. I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone who listened. Real nice meeting you this way in Zoom.
Yeah. We will need to start thinking of a program for 2025, won't we? I feel sad when it comes to an end. It's all it's such a mad panic to get it done, and then it all kind of is over very quickly. So thank you all. Right, I'm going to try and make sure this is all saved. So thank you all. Have a good evening, good rest of day, whatever time zone you're in. Good night. Goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye.